What I would like to do today is to talk to you basically about my story as the first Muslim chaplain on active duty in the Department of Defense. This is actually you all will be the first ones to actually hear this narrative because I just retired a month ago. And having said that, I should also say that recently I've been selected to be the first in another area. And that is, I will continue my ministerial experience with the Department of Veteran Affairs, and I will be located in Baltimore at the Baltimore VA Medical Center and at the VA Medical Center in Perry Point, Maryland, which is the largest VA medical facility in the state of Maryland. I'm very privileged and I feel very grateful for that opportunity to serve in that capacity because it will give me the opportunity to continue to work with our veterans and their families, to work with many of the administrators, many of the religious leaders, and community activists as we move towards finding solutions to help our soldiers who have served most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we all, of course, hear daily about the onslaught of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it matters not what your religious preference is. If you're in this business of human service delivery, you will be impacted by those soldiers or family members that have been impacted by the war. Let me first, before I get started, ask how many of you today, this afternoon, have served on active duty. Let me just see by a show of hands. How many veterans do we have here today? One, okay. How many of you have an immediate relative who have served on active duty, a father or mother, brother, sister? How many of you had an uncle or an aunt, an extended family member? Okay, very good, thank you. So even though many of you have not experienced the life of being a soldier, an airman, or a Marine, or a sailor, you've known someone who have. And this is a good thing, in my opinion, because every nation requires a defense capability to protect its freedoms. And many years ago, when I contemplated, I'm actually, I was Vietnam era eligible, as a matter of fact, but I didn't get selected to go into the military service during the Vietnam War. And I was kind of, in a way, glad I didn't, because I kind of like our system the way it works now, where you have the opportunity to, make the personal decision, just like we make other personal decisions, like attending this university, for example, or when to get married. Personal choices. So I made the personal choice to serve my country. I didn't become a Johnny-come-lately when it comes to service or love and respect for the freedoms that we have and sometimes that we take for granted. But I felt an obligation and a commitment to show that loyalty, that love, that respect, that discipline by using the talents that God has given me to help others. Prior to military service, I served as a licensed clinical social worker here in the state of Michigan, in Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor in Washtenaw County. And after I left here in 1992, I received a phone call that I would, I was actually working in the, when I left here in 1992, I worked for about 2 years in the Department of Corrections as a chaplain in the Department of Corrections in New York. I worked in a medium men's and a medium women's correctional facility as a chaplain. And it was shortly after that that I received a phone call one day when I was at work at the correctional facility that I was selected as the nation's first Muslim chaplain. Thank you. Obviously, it didn't take a whole long time for me to make a decision that I was going to leave the prison and I was going to serve. Not only because I was the first, because I would have served if I was the 5th or the 10th. But obviously to be given the privilege to be a pioneer at anything, it provides its own set of challenges and benefits. So I want to talk to you this afternoon about some of those challenges. And one of the things I learned was that, as the Quran says, as God says in the Quran, فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. Verily, with every difficulty comes ease or relief. And the way I understand that in this context is that I should not have expected to receive any benefits unless I had challenges to go along with it. And so one of my initial challenges was somehow to be able to navigate my own Muslim community into an area of acceptance of what I was about to do, because no one had done it before me. Oh, we've had many people served. Muslims have served in the United States Armed Forces, whether you know it or not, since the American Revolution. And if you've never visited the Muslim American Museum, you should, in Washington, D.C. It's something that is eye-opening. But I was privileged to have the opportunity to be the first to tread this territory. And now we have 11 Muslim chaplains in the armed services. And I believe that the momentum there has also helped us to achieve chaplaincy positions in other institutions, like our universities. More of our women have taken on chaplain positions. And I believe our Muslim community has a much deeper understanding, a much more robust understanding of what chaplaincy actually is. For a moment, I'll digress and I'll just say a little bit about what chaplaincy actually is. Because to be a chaplain basically means that one has to have the desire to love people. All people, not just those who come under the rubric of your congregation, whether you're a rabbi, a priest, a pastor, or an imam. And depending upon the institutional bureaucratic environment that you may work in, you may be called at times to work with, for those who are not a part of your congregational flock. And you must do it with the type of commitment as though they were. When I worked in the prisons, there were periodic times that I had to give death notices to inmates who were not of my religious background. And on active duty as a battalion chaplain, which is an entry-level job in the military, in the Army, the battalion is about 800 soldiers. Only about 4 of them were, out of that 800 in my first assignment at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Only about my first assignment, there was about 450 people. I was in the 28th Combat Support Hospital, and I only had 2 Muslims out of 450. But all of the 450 people and those that had wives and children were mine. They belonged to me. I was responsible for them, for their spiritual welfare and well-being. And they came to know not only about me and Islam, but also what the possibilities were of having someone that was an other, in one sense, to become their spiritual advisor. One time when I was at Fort Bragg, I went to the hospital and visited an old man who was about 80 years old. He was originally from South Carolina. Now, I was brought up in Buffalo, New York, up north. And for those of you that are from up north, you know, sometimes we have issues with people of European American background from the South, from the history. This is our history. And I was a little bit uncertain about how this particular pastoral engagement was going to turn out. Well, me and this man, who was very red in skin color, ended up getting so close to each other that he gave me something that I still have today. It was a 1949 model Cadillac that he had put together himself as a token of his appreciation and of his love and respect for me as a chaplain. So that's a single example of how sometimes we may project what something might be, and we don't give ourselves permission just to be who we are or who God has called us to be in the midst of somebody else's suffering or pain. And who knows, that man may have had as much anxiety as I did. But the outcome is that not only did he demonstrate that he had less anxiety than me, he was able to demonstrate that if necessary, he could care for me better than I was able to care for him initially. So this is the way that a chaplain has to respond. You can't go into a situation, look on the door, look at the name and say, oh, I can't go in that room if you work in a hospital. I can't talk to that person because I think they might be Catholic. You have to be the type of heart to say, no, that person is a human being. And this is the presenting problem. And this is what I can offer. And when we give ourselves permission to perform our ministry that way, as I learned to do, as I had the desire to do, it just enhanced my ability to work with people again and again and again, and get stronger in it and develop better at it, and to eventually become a supervisor of other chaplains from different faith group backgrounds. Because it's one thing to be a chaplain yourself and minister to your own flock as an imam or a pastor or a rabbi would do in a church, in a synagogue, or a mosque, but it's another thing to be in an institution and then be able to minister those people and maybe perhaps one day even supervise others who may come from those dominant faith groups, as I had the opportunity to do in the United States Army. And one of my challenges was that I had a chaplain who didn't think too kindly of Muslims. He was from Texas. He had never grown up around African Americans. But it really had nothing to do with me personally, because he really didn't know me personally. He was just afraid of what he thought I represented in his fantasy world. But he got over it. I got over it. And we deployed to Iraq together, and we did what we had to do. and we came back. And we appreciated each other that much more after that experience. So this is the foundation from which I think all of us who are looking into chaplaincy as perhaps a career opportunity need to understand that, you know, it's one thing to be in an Islamic center, it's one thing to be in a mosque, it's one thing to be in an area where you have, you know, a very controlled environment. And you may be the one who gets the last word most of the time, like most imams do. But when you're in a situation where you may not get the last word, you may not always be the one that people will come to, but you still have a seat at the table. You still have a place. When I worked at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, I always made sure that people knew whenever we had case conferences or discharge planning meetings, I wanted them to know that this chair belonged to the chaplain. Not the Muslim chaplain, but the chaplain. And so, you know, my approach was always in that vein, coming across that way. And this I learned from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. When he sent his companions to Abyssinia, he knew exactly what he was doing. And he knew that in order for the community to be protected, he had to trust others, the others that sometimes we get very anxious about. And so the example of how we should treat the others, how we should be ourselves as helping professionals has already been demonstrated for us. So I never felt like I needed to go into this to reinvent something. My second greatest challenge was to learn as much as I could about how Prophet Muhammad did things, peace and blessings be upon him, in most every situation that I could possibly find the information. And then try and pattern myself after those examples. Or I would consult with others more learned than myself in certain situations to get the best advice about how to proceed in medical situations, in situations that might involve religious accommodations, in situations that might involve women's rights. And so it was much easier for me to deal with these challenges as I learned more about how the best example for humanity had handled them, rather than trying to always figure it out on my own, feeling as though I had to have the answer. The Muslim community is not monolithic. We are very diverse. We have Shiites, we have Sunnis, we have people who are Sufi, and all of these people are in uniform. When people used to ask me who my congregation was, I said basically they're the same people that's out here in America. Because from each of these groups, there will be people who will serve this country, regardless to what their parents may think or what their imam may think. I have encountered all kinds of soldiers who have come into military service against the advice of somebody. And the respect and admiration that I've personally had for them has only empowered me to be that much more energized. Because I used to tell them all the time, one of my more favorite sayings was, if you weren't here, I wouldn't have a job. That's why I decided to do what I did. It's because they decided to do what they did. And what I have seen over the years of my career is that whatever I experienced or whatever they experienced as Muslim soldiers, it was always the same. It was parallel. And I used to tell them, it doesn't matter whether you're an officer, whether you're enlisted, you're a Muslim. When Ramadan comes around, I'm going to experience the same things you experience. For example, one of the big issues was, can soldiers do PT during Ramadan? Can they run? PT is physical training. I know we use a lot of acronyms in the Army, so if I use one and forget to say what it is, just raise your hand and I'll do that. I'll explain it. But PT is physical training. So during Ramadan, you have some soldiers who are so disciplined. Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where I was assigned as an instructor at the chaplain school and also the largest basic training installation in the Army, we have most of our soldiers are enlisted young soldiers. They come through there. And I used to have classes with them. And they would come to me and ask me, Imam, you know, my sergeant won't let me fast. Because they say I have to do PT and I have to have water. And I would meet with them, oftentimes, and consult with them. And I would tell them that they don't have the authority to not allow someone to at least begin the fast and see what the results would be. And with that, whenever they complied with that, there was never a soldier that did not complete the fast while going through their basic training. So to have been there as a representative was so important for many of those soldiers. And so many of those young soldiers, as those who used to come to our classes, took Shahada. From hearing about the reality of what Islam truly was, as opposed to what they would think or what they heard through media sources and whatnot about what Islam was. Then there was 9/11. During 9/11, September the 11th, 2001, I was assigned to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and I deployed to the Pentagon right after it was hit. And if any of you were in Washington, D.C. at that time, you know you couldn't get within a mile of the Pentagon after this happened. The only ones could get there were those who were there doing some type of work, either removing bodies from the wreckage, or in our case, medical personnel, chaplains, mental health professionals. We were there ministering and providing critical incident stress debriefing for those that were. And a team of myself, a psychologist, a social worker, and a nurse every day went from Walter Reed Army Medical Center to the Pentagon. And we ministered to those soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division, or the Old Guard, who were going in the building and removing the body parts. Plus, I had to do Salatul Jummah right down there on the grounds, where many of my Muslim soldiers was also there doing some type of job, some type of function. And then the second week, I had to do the Jummah inside the Pentagon. And the smoke and the gasoline and all the jet fuel, you could still smell it. So you could imagine, if you could imagine yourself being in a situation like that on a day-to-day basis. And one of my concerns was that people weren't going to accept me. They were going to be hostile towards me. They were going to be angry. And it never happened one day. Not one single day. Now, you can look at it on a spiritual level and say, oh, well, Allah was protecting you, brother. And I certainly accept that. Because I believe wherever I go, Allah protects me. But I also knew that there's something in the spirit of the American people that when you put that uniform on, people don't care what your religious background is. When they see me, when they've seen me coming through the airport with my uniform on, I've never had a person do to me what was done to some of our soldiers during the Vietnam War era. Exactly the opposite now. Thank you for your service. Now, unfortunately, I must say to you, I haven't gotten that a whole lot from the Muslim community. And that's been the sort of catch-22. But one day I was sitting in the airport in Dallas, and this little 6 or 7-year-old girl ran up to me and gave me a piece of candy and said, "Thank you for your service." One of the most heartwarming things I ever experienced. Now, she was with her mother. Certainly her mother told her to go and do it. But this is the type of spirit. She didn't look at my uniform to see what my name was. She just saw the uniform. And that is the basic experience that I have encountered since 9/11 and going through airports, especially when I was in uniform. Now, I've also gone through airports with a kufi on, this, and have experienced exactly the opposite. Take everything out of your pockets, what are you doing with this Quran, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, yes. In fact, I did it once on purpose, right after 9/11, just to see, as a kind of experiment, whether there would be a difference in treatment. And when I had the kufi on, I was asked a whole lot of questions. When I came through in uniform, it was yes, sir, no, sir. Same person, same individual, but it let me know the distinction and how just what you wear can also have a major impact on people's thinking. But it strengthened me in my resolve for my ministry as a Muslim chaplain on active duty. One of the last challenges that I encountered was the tragedy at Fort Hood. I knew Nadel Hassan. I had spoken to him. He was an intern at Walter Reed when I was there. And it was me who recommended that he be a layperson at Fort Hood, pardon me. But I had no clue that he was going to do what he actually did, nor did I have any idea that he was thinking about or had any inclination to do what he actually did. But he came and sat in 2 or 3 of my khutbahs right before I left to go to Fort Hood when I was at Walter Reed. I left there in 2002. And he actually came there. Like I said, he was a resident. He did his residency there. Psychiatric residency? Yeah, he did his psychiatry residency at Walter Reed when I was there as a chaplain. And that's when we met. He used to attend the masjid there in Springfield, Maryland. So the only thing I knew about him was he was a psychiatrist and he used to come to Jummah. Seemed to be okay. They needed a layperson out at Fort Hood. He had the rank. He had the knowledge. And so we learned something from that. Now we do things a little differently when we select lay people. That was a lesson learned. And it is, as unfortunate as it was, one of the things, again, that I learned, that whatever I experienced, whatever anxiety I experienced, I knew that all my Muslim soldiers were also going through the same thing. So it was it was a very difficult time when that took place. So I was called by the FBI. They had 2 phone calls on his phone that had my number on it. And right before he did this, he called me and told me that some soldiers had broken his windows in his car because he had on a bumper sticker that Islam is the way. And as a result of that, some soldiers, more than likely, damaged his car, damaged his vehicle. And this was about a month before this had taken place. So, of course, they called me to find out, how did I know him? What did we talk about? Blah, blah, blah. I was always very honest with them, very upfront, invited them to Jummah, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, it was certainly obviously a very tragic situation. It was a very traumatic situation, and it caused a lot of difficulty in our community. But these are the things that not only as chaplains, but as a Muslim community, and particularly as professionals, we have to find ourselves ready for and hopefully prepared for, in terms of our training, in terms of our knowledge, in terms of our networking capabilities. All of those things, we have to make sure that we are absolutely ready for whatever contingency that comes our way. We have a major crisis right now in Syria that is going to eventually be at our doorstep, whether we know it or not. And many of the people who are in Turkey will eventually become refugees to this country. Who do you think they're going to go to? They're going to go to the mosques and the Islamic centers throughout the United States, wherever they're placed. And they're going to depend on people like you and me for support. So my question is to you, is that as these particular world events continue to impact us professionally and personally, how ready and prepared are we to deal with them? This is hard work. It's not easy. But it is work that we have to be prepared for, that we have to be professionally and personally ready to deal with. And I would also say that we have to allow ourselves to be ready to work with others collaboratively outside of our circle and not just depend on ourselves. The communities are getting too small, and the walls are not as tall as they used to be. They're coming down. And we're being forced, whether we want to or not, to work closer and closer and closer with one another, as Christians, as Jews, as Muslims, as human beings. The benefits have been tremendous, absolutely tremendous. Invitations to the White House for iftar, countless numbers of shahadas, soldiers, family members, establishing all kinds of policies for religious accommodations and influencing the system on First Amendment as it relates to religious accommodations and Muslims in particular. having the opportunity to do all kinds of training on Islam to those who never heard anything about Islam in their life, who have the responsibility to impact Muslims 24/7. So those are just sort of, in a very capsulized way, some of the things that I wanted you to have some idea of what this vessel standing before you has had to encounter. And whatever you have heard, know that there's been hundreds of others just like me going through the same thing. My concern is that if they're not doing okay with the experiences that they have encountered, I want to make sure that they go to the right places to get the help that they need. That's the thing that's important now. It's not whether or not we should be on active duty as Muslims, or the reality is, and I've told Muslims this for many years, there are things that are going to happen in our lives that we cannot control. We either learn to accept them and deal with them or move on. The reality is, if we allow ourselves to get stuck because we can't change it, all we do is just mess up our own lives. I've chosen to train and read and try and prepare myself, and to forgive and to love and to move on. That's what I've chosen to do. And I hope that you also have chosen to do that in your own way, in your own special ways, so that we can truly be able to take on the major tasks that lie before us. And I think that we're becoming more and more prepared to do that, because I can remember a time not too long ago where you couldn't get imams and mental health people in the same room. It wasn't that long ago. I'm serious. And because I made the decision to put that uniform on, people have come to accept that, even though they don't want to, because they know they can't change it. And that's just the way life goes. I think it was mentioned this morning that the earth or the ground is moving under us all the time and things are constantly shifting. That is a true statement. And even as we speak, the ground is shifting and things are changing. So I thank you all for your attention, and especially after lunch, where it is very difficult to keep one's eyes open and alert. But in looking around, I think I only saw 2 or 3 people who actually dozed, and you know who you are. I am not going to call you out. I'm not going to dime you, but you know who you are. May God bless all of us. May we continue to do the good work that we're doing. Let us continue to work collaboratively. I don't know if we have about 5 minutes to take some questions.